Good evening. This is a meeting of the Police Oversight Board for Albuquerque. My name is Joanne Fine, and I'm chair. And I welcome you to this meeting. We have a lot to cover, so I would like it if we just get started.
As it relates to Dan Gabaldon, I-022-17, you have before you a non-concurrence letter for that case, and I will detail my findings.
In a second.
That's it.
Yeah. I need you to recap it, honey. I can't read it here and remember everything. So can you recap it for us? Can you
yes, I'm going to go through that. I'm going to go through my findings for.
on all three?
No, just I-22-17.
Just this one. Okay. All right.
Oh.
So for the audience, when we concur, it means that the IA investigation or the CERT investigation or officer involved shooting investigation, we agree with what they found, what the department found. And in this case, we do not agree. And Ed's about to tell us why.
In the case of I-22-17, bless you. The shooting occurred June 4th, 2015. The multi-jurisdictional investigative team concluded its investigation May 7 of 2015. APD Internal Affairs completed its investigation August 23rd of 2017. The District Attorney's Office has not ruled on this case. This case does not have time waivers for the officers. This case comes before the board as a review of an investigation conducted by the Internal Affairs Division of the Albuquerque Police Department. The findings by Internal Affairs exonerate the officers on all counts. I do not concur with those findings. My non-concurrence is as follows. 2-52-4 deadly force. A, the decision to use deadly force falls under the general requirements for all uses of force as outlined in Policy 2-52-3. Additionally, the reasonableness of the officer's decision will include reasonable belief the subject presents an immediate threat to cause physical injury to the officer, another officer, or another member of the public, and that's serious physical injury. Probable cause for the officer to believe the subject has just committed a crime involving threatened infliction of serious physical injury to another, or deadly force is necessary to prevent the escape of the subject in order to protect the public or another officer. Paragraph B of that policy states officers need not exhaust lesser options of force in order to use deadly force. On June 4th, 2015, numerous members of the gang squad of the Albuquerque Police Department and other specialized units set out to find and arrest Dan Gabaldon. Mr. Gabaldon was wanted on a felony warrant for allegedly driving a vehicle at an officer of the Albuquerque Police Department. The incident happened a few days earlier and caused the officer to discharge his weapon at the vehicle. Members of the unit, the gang squad unit and the specialized unit, were advised of these allegations. They developed information he was staying at a trailer in a trailer at 98th and Central. Members of the unit, quote, sat on, unquote, the trailer, meaning observed the trailer, and eventually a male they believed to be Gabaldon entered a vehicle and drove away from the trailer. Members of the unit began to follow and track the vehicle. During this tracking, a member of the unit was able to positively identify the driver as Mr. Gabaldon. The sergeant in charge of the unit authorized a VBM. That's a vehicle blocking maneuver to stop the vehicle. All members of this unit were driving undercover vehicles without government license plates. Mr. Gabaldon continued to operate the vehicle within an adjacent southwest neighborhood. Members of the unit began to position themselves to perform the VBM. However, prior to executing the VBM, according to statements from the unit, a decision was made to conduct a, quote, high-risk stop, unquote, instead of a vehicle blocking maneuver. While executing this high-risk stop, Detective M collided with one of the undercover units by backing into it. He then exited his vehicle, placing himself directly in the path of the vehicle still under the control of Mr. Gabaldon. This is a violation of 2-52-4E, deadly force in motor vehicles, which states, when the only means of assault on an officer is by motor vehicle, officers B shall not knowingly place themselves into the path of a moving vehicle or the likely path of a moving vehicle that is currently stopped but still under the immediate control of the driver. Mr. Gabaldon was still behind the wheel. Mr. Gabaldon drove his vehicle in the direction of Detective M. Detective M discharged his firearm at Mr. Gabaldon, striking the vehicle twice. The vehicle driven by Mr. Gabaldon then collided with another member of the unit's, the specialized unit's vehicle that was prepared to do the VBM. This allowed officers to temporarily contain Mr. Gabaldon. As stated in the Deadly Force Policy 2-52-3, it is incorporated as a requirement. 2-53 H and I state, officers are expected to recognize their approach to citizen interactions. To recognize their approach to citizen interactions may influence whether a situation escalates to the need of use of force, and when practicable, officers must not engage in unreasonable actions or tactics that precipitate the use of force as a result of tactical, strategic, and procedural errors that unduly jeopardizes their safety or the safety of others. Detective M participated in the use of deadly force 2-52-4 Detective M precipitated the use of deadly force by his poor tactics and approach during the, quote, high-risk stop, unquote. The units should have requested a marked unit to conduct a traffic stop. He should have never exited his vehicle, being he was in the direct path of this driver. Findings. The CPOA finds that Detective M's conduct is sustained regarding the allegations of a violation of this SOP, which means the investigation determined by a preponderance of the evidence that the alleged misconduct did occur. Detective H arrived on the scene after the VBM and while officers attempted to arrest Mr. Gabaldon. He parked just adjacent to the group of vehicles. Officers were using less lethal means to extract Mr. Gabaldon from the vehicle, including beanbag rounds and taser probes fired at Mr. Gabaldon through the broken out vehicle windows. Mr. Gabaldon was not complying with officer commands. Mr. Gabaldon exited the vehicle rolling onto the ground and simultaneously removing the taser probes. He then fled on foot and officers gave chase. Detective H returned to his vehicle to engage in the chase. Detective H passed the officers chasing on foot and caught up to Mr. Gabaldon. He then turned his vehicle to the right and struck Mr. Gabaldon with his vehicle. Mr. Gabaldon was knocked onto the sidewalk, and officers engaged Mr. Gabaldon to take him into custody. The striking of Mr. Gabaldon constitutes deadly force. Detective H did not articulate any perceived fear of immediate threat of death or great bodily harm to officers or the public. In fact, Detective M.K., the officer closest to Mr. Gabaldon during the foot chase, was asked directly by detectives if he perceived Mr. Gabaldon was an immediate threat of death or great bodily harm. He answered no, Mr. Gabaldon had abandoned his weapon, the vehicle. The CPOA finds Detective H's conduct sustained regarding the allegations of a violation of this SOP, which means the investigation determined by a preponderance of the evidence that the alleged misconduct did occur. 252-6B, use of authorized tool states, officers will use only tools and techniques with which they have been trained unless the threat escalates so rapidly the officer must use any means necessary to defend themselves or others. Detective H's striking of Mr. Gabaldon with his vehicle was not a by any means necessary scenario. The CPOA finds that Detective H's conduct is sustained regarding the allegation of this violation, a violation of this SOP, which means the investigation determined by a preponderance of the evidence that the alleged misconduct did occur. Other issues, the use of electronic control devices, the taser. 2-25-6G states in part that the electronic control device is a use of force tool which is designed to use propelled wires or direct contact to conduct electrical charge to primarily affect motor function and or the sensory nervous system, and it can be used in 3 distinct modes. In particular, in this case, we're looking at the fact that due to the incapacitating effects of the ECD, officers should not expect an individual under the effects of the ECD to comply with commands. The device may also be used in certain circumstances in, quote, drive stun mode. This involves removing or not removing the cartridge based upon the situation, pressing the unit against an appropriate area of the body based on training, and officers must understand that when the device is used in this manner, it limits the effectiveness, is minimally effective compared to the standoff mode, which would be firing from a distance. And for this reason, the deployment with the probes is more desirable than the drive stun. However, the subject is, when using the device, the same deployment guidelines apply whether you're doing it in the standoff mode, firing from a distance, or whether you're using the drive stun. The same standards apply for compliance. After Mr. Gabaldon is struck by the vehicle, officers converge and attempt to take him into custody. Detective M and Detective P are observed simultaneously deploying their electronic control device, taser, on Mr. Gabaldon. Both are using the weapon in the drive stun mode. Detective P on Mr. Gabaldon's legs, while Detective M is drive stunning Mr. Gabaldon's neck and upper back. The officers are not allowing Mr. Gabaldon to comply with their commands. Instead, the officers continue to shock Mr. Gabaldon while other officers attempt to handcuff the subject. Additionally, Detective M strikes Mr. Gabaldon in the head with the taser. There were enough officers in position to contain and restrain Mr. Gabaldon without the misuse of the tasers. CPOA finds that Detective M's conduct sustained regarding the allegation of a violation of this SOP, which means the investigation determined by preponderance of the evidence that the alleged misconduct did occur. Recommendations and observations. The scope of this internal investigation is too narrow and needs to include a review of Detective P, Sergeant V, and the entire operation. The criminal investigation of this case clearly focused on the actions of Mr. Gabaldon and not the actors in the case. For example, there are no crime scene photos of the entire VBM, no photos of the truck and the point of impact where Detective H's vehicle struck Mr. Gabaldon. The IA investigators' analysis of this case should not be focused on Graham versus Connor or Tennessee v. Garner. It should be focused on the policies in place when the incident occurred. This is an administrative review, not a legal brief. The exonerations of these officers in this case further illustrates the monitor's opinion that the department lacks the ability to hold its officers accountable. As it relates to the discipline, for Detective M, 4 sustained violations, the first being a level 4, the second being a level 3, the third being a level 5, and the fourth being a level 2. And finding that the firearm discharge was unjustified. Recommendation is a suspension of 512 hours. Currently, there were no disciplinary issues within this officer's file, so all are considered a first offense, nor were there any disciplinary actions back in 2015 when this incident occurred. For Detective H, sustained on 2 violations, a level 2 and a level 6. A written reprimand for the level 6 and 240-hour suspension for the level 2. And as with the previous officer, there were no disciplinary histories within the officer's file for 2015 or currently, so therefore it's being evaluated on a first offense level. And I stand for questions.
I want to recap this. Sometimes I get lost in the numbers, so I want to recap it. So what I remember, tell me if I'm mistaken. At the end of May, there was an event in which Mr. Gabaldon ended up coming at Detective M with his car. That didn't happen in May. What happened in May?
There was a similar incident that happened in May, but it did not involve Detective M. It involved another officer.
But
that was
the focus was there was an event in which
that was the reason
person,
for the warrant, for the arrest warrant.
Okay, so there was an event in which Mr. Gabaldon came at an officer with a car. Now they decide they have enough evidence to arrest him, and so they go to his place, they sit on his place, they see him, he takes off, they follow him, and now he is somebody who's come at an officer with a car before, and so and he's in a car, and he comes at the officer, and they fire into the car. So his weapon is his car, and that is a deadly force thing, and so they respond with a deadly force, which is firing the gun. They didn't hit him, and now he gets out of the car and he takes off. And they chase after him, and one of the detectives gets in a car and takes after him and hits him with the car. He is not in a car, so he is not armed. He didn't have a gun and he didn't have a car, so he had no weapons, and he was still hit with the car, with an officer's car. And then the 2 detectives zapped him when he was down already, zapped him with a taser in the neck and in the leg. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And that is the summation of this case. And so the key ingredient here is once he got out of his car, he was weaponless, and deadly force was used against him. Fair?
Chair Fine, yes, that's my assessment.
Okay. I just want to make sure we get it in a tight roll.
I have a question. Did they actually use VBM?
Chair Fine, Board Member Waits, yes, they did. The incident happened very quickly. The shots were fired at the vehicle, but because there were other vehicles right there present, he ended up running into another gang unit vehicle. There was a collision, and then the other vehicles were able to come in and contain him.
And the reason I asked that question it says here, according to the statement from the unit, a high-risk stop instead of VDM, instead of a VBM?
What's the difference?
Chair Fine, Board Member Waits, yes. Somehow within this operation, some of the detectives decided to attempt a high-risk stop instead of what they were authorized with the operation to do the vehicle blocking maneuver. And the high-risk stop is essentially like a felony stop where you would take cover, use the most precautions, have your weapons at low ready, and then order the occupant to comply with your commands to get the occupant or occupants out of the vehicle. In no protocol that I'm aware of does an officer conduct a high-risk stop from in front of a vehicle. That would be unsafe, and those operations take place from behind a vehicle.
I remember you saying, too, when we met at the Case Review Committee, that another factor that bothered you was that they were not in marked cars and they were not in any kind of uniforms. They didn't have anything that, so as far as Mr. Gabaldon is concerned, one could make the argument that he had no idea they were cops.
Chair Fine, that isn't, yes, that's correct. Until they exited the vehicle, they did have on their vests, which said police, and their outer wear, which said police. However, none of the vehicles were marked vehicles, had emergency equipment, or had government plates. They were all undercover vehicles. So you cannot leap to the assumption that he knew that the police were pursuing him.
Until he got out of the car.
Until they got out of the car. There's not a lot of verbal saying police until a few minutes into the execution of the VBM.
So are you saying that, to Leonard's question, that some of them did the VBM and some of them did a high-risk stop?
Chair Fine, that's correct.
All right.
Director Harness, what happened to Gabaldon?
Chair Fine, Dr. Ring, I don't know, to be honest with you. I mean, he was arrested and taken for treatment. He had a significant head wound, the origin of which was undetermined by the investigation. I mean, he was involved in a vehicle crash where airbags deployed. And so there was no determination as to the cause of his injuries, but there was a couple of head injuries and other scrapes and things along his arms and knees.
Didn't you say he got bopped in the head with the stun gun?
He was struck in the head with the taser, yes.
And the probes.
Injury from being hit by the vehicle?
Took the probes out. There's no way to know.
Chair Fine, Dr. Ring, that's not a part of the investigative file, which is, as I stated, incomplete.
Okay.
Did any of the officers get hurt? You don't know that either.
Chair Fine, there was one officer injured, but that was from Detective M backing into his vehicle, causing that airbag to deploy, where he had to crawl out of the side door and injured his ankle.
Backing up. TJ just told us about backing up.
I have a question. Mr. Harness, if the file was more complete, do you think it would could change, these hypotheticals, I'm sorry, but could it change your conclusion? Because I'm looking at it and I'm saying, well, based on the preponderance of evidence, And based on that and an incomplete file, then you could make this conclusion. What niggles at me is, at some point, I don't understand is that the police have a right, maybe, or when they pursue their duty or execute their duty. We don't know if if he's not also carrying another weapon or whatever, because his actions are already in motion, and they're already in motion. So it just bothers me that you don't have a complete file, and we don't really know other things. It certainly begs a question of better notation, better completion, better everything.
Did you think this file was incomplete or just the cert cases?
Chair Fine, I think that this investigation is incomplete. It focused on the actions of Mr. Gabaldon, and it did not focus on the actions of the officer.
Right, that's
Gotcha,
right.
gotcha.
And the officer's actions in these cases need to be scrutinized just like any other actor within the incident. And there's only one, throughout all of the interviews, there's only one detective that asks the direct question, did Mr. Gabaldon, did you perceive that he was an immediate threat of great bodily harm or death? And the answer was no. But deadly force was used. And during the VBM, the officers are using less lethal force at that point in time. They're using beanbags and they're using taser, and one officer, as a matter of fact, disengages from using the beanbag because he's in too close a proximity to Mr. Gabaldon and fears that that would be a use of deadly force. So post the vehicle being driven at Detective M, during the VBM and after, there is no articulation that Mr. Gabaldon was perceived to be a threat of great bodily harm or death. And that's according to the most contemporaneous interviews of the incident.
Okay. Case number C, Danon Gabaldon, 1-022-17. This is a non-concurrence, and I need a motion.
I move we send Dr. Harness's letter.
Regarding that case,
Yes.
I need a second. Discussion? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign? That passes.
I'm sorry, Chair Fine, just so the record is clear, all of these recommendations are based upon the policies that were in place in June of 2015. The use of force policies and the disciplinary recommendations are all in accordance with what was in place for June 4th of 2015.
Is it your perception that that the investigation done by APD was using a different standard, or the standard that was current at the time?
Chair Fine, no. The standard was the same. The policies were, we evaluated it under the same policies.
That they did?
As they did, yes.
Right.
And in the file, there was the June of 2014 use of force policy, which was in place at that point. And I just wanted to clear it up for the public and the record that this evaluation is being done on the basis of what was in place in 2015, not today.
Okay.